The dust-stained windows of Bozeman's only saloon reflected the dying light of the Montana sunset as Wade Dawson's calloused fingers clenched around his whiskey glass. Knuckles white with tension as his cold eyes scanned the rowdy establishment. He'd buried his heart alongside his family 15 years ago, and that suited him just fine until the saloon doors swung open, revealing a woman with eyes like cornflowers and a face marred by bruises that told a story Wade wasn't looking to hear. Montana Territory, 1876. Wade had always been more comfortable with the company of horses than people. At 35, he'd carved out a reputation across Montana Territory as a man who could break the wildest mustangs and track the most elusive outlaws, but who couldn't be persuaded to stay in town longer than it took to collect his pay, buy supplies, and drink enough whiskey to ensure dreamless sleep. "Another," Wade grunted, sliding his empty glass across the scarred wooden bar to Joe, the bartender who'd long ago learned not to attempt conversation with the taciturn cowboy. "Might want to slow down there, Dawson," Joe said anyway, pouring another 2 fingers of amber liquid. "Night's still young." Wade didn't respond, just laid a coin on the counter and retrieved his drink. The saloon buzzed with the usual Friday evening crowd, ranch hands flush with their week's pay, miners taking a break from the back-breaking work in the hills, and a handful of card players hunched over their tables, fortunes rising and falling with each dealt hand. He'd come to Bozeman reluctantly, only because Sheriff Taylor had sent word about a job tracking a horse thief who'd made off with 3 prize stallions from the Henderson Ranch. The money was good, and Wade needed enough to get through the coming winter at his remote cabin in the foothills. 2 more days, he told himself. Track the thief, return the horses, collect payment, and then back to blessed solitude. The batwing doors of the saloon swung open, bringing with them a gust of cool evening air and the sudden hush of conversation. Wade wouldn't have looked up except for that unnatural quiet that rippled through the usually boisterous room. She stood in the doorway, a slender figure in a travel-worn blue dress, her honey-colored hair falling loose around shoulders that seemed too slight to bear whatever burden had brought her here. But it was her face that caused Wade's breath to catch, one eye swollen nearly shut, a split lip still crusted with blood, and a purple bruise blooming across her left cheekbone. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then she stepped fully into the saloon, her gaze sweeping the room with a dignity that belied her battered appearance. "I'm looking for Sheriff Taylor," she said, her voice steady despite the quiver Wade detected beneath the words. "Sheriff's office is down the street, madam," Joe said, his usual gruff tone softened. "Closed for the night, though. He'll be back come morning." The woman's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "I see, thank you." Wade watched as she turned to leave, noting the careful way she moved, like someone nursing injuries beyond the visible ones on her face. He told himself it wasn't his concern. Other people's troubles had a way of becoming your own if you let them, and Wade had spent 15 years ensuring that never happened. But then she swayed slightly, one hand reaching for the doorframe to steady herself. "Madam," Joe called, already moving from behind the bar, "you all right?" She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes rolled back and she crumpled toward the floor. Wade moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 long strides and catching her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and up close, the bruising looked even worse, finger marks visible around her throat, a nasty gash hidden in her hairline. "Someone's worked her over good," muttered a voice from the crowd. "Doc Miller's closed up for the night," someone else said. Wade looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms, cursing silently. This wasn't his problem. He'd learned long ago that getting involved only led to pain. "There's a room above the general store," Joe offered. "Martha Wilkins lets it out. She'd take care of the lady till morning." Wade nodded curtly and headed for the door, the woman's head lolling against his shoulder. He told himself he was only doing what any decent man would do, and that once he delivered her to Martha Wilkins, his obligation would be fulfilled. The night air had turned cold, stars pricking through the darkening sky as Wade carried the woman down Bozeman's Main Street. She stirred against him, a small sound of pain escaping her lips, and he found himself unconsciously adjusting his hold to make her more comfortable. Martha Wilkins, a stout widow who ran the general store with ruthless efficiency, answered his knock with a flour-dusted apron and a suspicious frown that melted into concern when she saw the woman in Wade's arms. Gracious heavens. Bring her in, she bustled, already leading the way upstairs to the small room she sometimes rented to travelers. What happened to the poor dear? Don't know. She came looking for the sheriff, then fainted, Wade said, laying the woman carefully on the neatly made bed. Thought you might look after her till morning. Martha was already examining the woman's injuries with gentle fingers. Of course I will. Some water, clean rags, and my arnica salve should help with these bruises. You know her name? Wade shook his head. Never seen her before. The woman on the bed stirred, eyelids fluttering. Faith, she murmured faintly. My name is Faith Keller. Wade stepped back as Martha moved in with a damp cloth. You're safe now, Miss Keller. Rest easy. Faith's eyes opened fully then, one blue eye and one nearly swollen shut, focusing on Wade with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Thank you, she said softly. Wade nodded stiffly, backing toward the door. Sheriff will be at his office come morning. Martha here will take good care of you till then. You're leaving? There was no accusation in her voice, just a question. Got business to attend to, he said gruffly, though he had nowhere particular to be. Good night, madam. He didn't wait for her response, just tipped his hat to Martha and descended the stairs, trying to ignore the odd tightness in his chest. Outside on the darkened street, Wade took a deep breath of the cold night air, telling himself the woman Faith was no longer his concern. She had shelter, care, and would find the sheriff tomorrow. Whatever trouble she was in would be handled by those better equipped to deal with it than a solitary cowboy who preferred the company of horses to people. But as he walked back toward the small room he'd rented above the livery, the image of her bruised face stayed with him, and the echo of her voice saying his name kept him company through the long night. Morning brought no relief from thoughts of Faith Keller. Wade rose before dawn, as was his habit, and headed to the livery to check on his horse, a big bay gelding named Copper who'd been with him for 8 years. The horse nickered softly as Wade approached his stall. At least you're simple, Wade muttered, running a hand along Copper's sleek neck. Food, water, and a good gallop now and then, no complications. After tending to Copper, Wade walked to the sheriff's office, telling himself he was just keeping to his own schedule. He needed to discuss the horse thief job with Taylor anyway. Sheriff Taylor was already at his desk when Wade arrived, a cup of coffee steaming beside a stack of wanted posters. Dawson, Taylor greeted him with a nod. Early as usual, got those tracking details for you. But before the sheriff could continue, the door opened and Faith Keller walked in. In the clear light of morning, the bruises on her face looked even more vicious, blues and purples against her pale skin. She'd done something with her honey-colored hair, pulling it back into a neat bun, and her blue dress had been pressed, though Wade could see it was well worn. Sheriff Taylor. She asked. Her voice was stronger today, though still carrying that slight tremor Wade had noticed the night before. Taylor stood, removing his hat. That's me, madam. What can I do for you? My name is Faith Keller. I've come to report a crime. Her eyes flickered briefly to Wade, a flash of recognition, before returning to the sheriff. My husband was murdered 3 days ago in Helena. The men who did it are coming for me next. Wade had intended to leave once Faith arrived, to give her privacy for whatever business she had with the sheriff, but her words rooted him to the spot. Taylor gestured for Faith to sit in the chair across from his desk, his expression grave. That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Keller. Why don't you start from the beginning? Faith's hands twisted together in her lap. My husband, Edward Keller, was a banker in Helena. 6 months ago, he discovered discrepancies in accounts belonging to 3 local businessmen. He suspected they were using the bank to launder money from illegal operations, gambling, smuggling, possibly worse. She paused, swallowing hard. Edward was an honest man. He confronted them privately at first, wanting to handle it without scandal. They threatened him, but he wouldn't back down. He was gathering evidence to bring to the authorities when her voice faltered. When they killed him, Taylor finished quietly. Faith nodded. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong, but I knew, and they knew I knew. She gestured to her bruised face. This was their warning. They said next time they'd finish the job. Do you have names? Taylor asked, already pulling out paper to take notes. Victor Blackstone, James Harrington, and Frank Potter, they own half of Helena between them. Faith's voice hardened. They thought because I'm a woman I'd be too frightened to speak out, but Edward deserves justice. Wade found himself studying Faith with new eyes. There was steel beneath her delicate exterior, a determination he hadn't expected. Why Bozeman? He asked abruptly, drawing both their gazes. Helena's got a sheriff too. Faith's eyes met his, direct and unflinching despite the bruising. Because the Helena sheriff dines weekly with Victor Blackstone, and because Edward's brother lives here or used to. William Keller. I thought he could help, but his neighbor says he moved on 6 months ago. Taylor nodded thoughtfully. Well, Keller was here for a spell, moved on to California from what I heard. He tapped his pencil against the desk. Mrs. Keller, I believe your story, but these men are outside my jurisdiction. I can send a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena, but that'll take time. Time I don't have, Faith said quietly. They weren't subtle about their intentions, Sheriff. They'll be looking for me. Wade didn't plan to speak. It wasn't his business, and he'd learned long ago that other people's problems led to nothing but pain. But something about Faith Keller's quiet courage in the face of overwhelming odds moved something inside him that he'd thought long dead. My cabin, he said, the words surprising him as much as Taylor and Faith. It's a day's ride from here, hidden in the foothills. Nobody would find you there while the marshal investigates. Taylor's eyebrows shot up. Wade Dawson offering his private sanctuary to a stranger, it was unheard of. Faith looked at him with an expression Wade couldn't quite read. Why would you help me, Mr. Dawson? You don't know me. Don't know these men either, but I know their kind, Wade said gruffly. Men who beat women and murder honest folks deserve what's coming to them. For a long moment, Faith studied him, and Wade had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he wanted her to. I accept, she said finally. Thank you. Taylor looked between them, concern evident on his weathered face. Dawson, what about the Henderson job? Wade shrugged. Send Billy Hanson. Boy's a decent tracker. Won't catch the thief as quick as I would, but he'll get the job done, the sheriff sighed, clearly unhappy but accepting. I'll send that telegram to the marshal today, and I'll keep quiet about where Mrs. Keller's gone. Faith stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. I'll need to gather a few things. Mrs. Wilkins lent me some necessities, but we'll stop at the general store before we leave, Wade interrupted. Get whatever you need, best to be on the trail before noon. As they stepped out of the sheriff's office into the bright Montana morning, Wade wondered what madness had possessed him to offer his sanctuary to this woman. For 15 years, he'd lived by one rule: keep to yourself, and trouble passes you by. But one look at Faith Keller's bruised face had shattered that rule beyond repair, and Wade couldn't bring himself to regret it. They would leave for his cabin in a few hours, and then what? Wade had no answer, only the certainty that everything was about to change. The general store bustled with activity as Wade and Faith entered, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Several heads turned their way, curious eyes lingering on Faith's bruised face before darting away when they caught Wade's hard stare. Martha Wilkins emerged from behind the counter, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Mrs. Keller, I was wondering where you'd gotten to this morning, she said warmly before noticing Wade beside her. Something knowing flickered in the older woman's eyes. Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Wilkins has been very kind, Faith explained to Wade. She lent me a nightgown and helped me clean up last night. Martha waved away the thanks. Any decent person would do the same. Now, what brings you both here? Wade shifted uncomfortably. He preferred action to explanation. Mrs. Keller needs supplies. She'll be staying at my place for a while. If Martha was surprised by this announcement, she hid it well. Instead, she nodded briskly. Well then, let's get you outfitted properly. Can't have you heading into those hills without necessities. As Martha led Faith through the store, Wade trailed behind, listening as the storekeeper listed items Faith would need: warmer clothes, sturdy boots, toiletries, and other personal items he hadn't considered. He realized suddenly how ill-prepared his bachelor cabin would be for a woman's needs. "Add blankets," he told Martha, "and extra lamp oil, coffee too." Faith turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Mr. Dawson, this is very generous, but I can't possibly accept. It's not charity," Wade cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "It's practical. Can't have you freezing or stumbling around in the dark." A small smile touched Faith's lips, briefly transforming her battered face. "Then thank you for your practicality." While Martha gathered the remaining items and wrapped them for travel, Faith approached Wade, speaking in a lower voice. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Dawson. I have very little money. Edward's accounts were frozen after his death, and I left Helena with only what I could carry." Wade nodded. He'd suspected as much. "Don't concern yourself with that. I've got money saved." "I'll repay you," she insisted, a stubborn set to her jaw that told Wade arguing would be pointless. "Once this is over, every penny." "If it makes you feel better," he conceded, though he had no intention of accepting her money. Martha returned with several wrapped bundles and a list of their purchases. Wade paid without looking at the total, tucking the receipt into his pocket before Faith could see it. They left the store with arms full of parcels, heading toward the livery where Copper waited. "We'll need a horse for you," Wade said as they walked. "Something steady but with enough spirit for mountain trails." Faith hesitated. I'm not much of a rider, I'm afraid. Edward and I lived in town. We had a buggy for Sunday drives, but I've never ridden alone." Wade considered this new complication. "We could get a wagon, but it would slow us down considerably, and the trails to my cabin aren't exactly wagon-friendly." "I can learn," Faith said with determination. "If you'll teach me the basics, I'll manage." Wade studied her face, noting the resolve behind the bruises. "It won't be comfortable, especially with those injuries." "Nothing about this situation is comfortable, Mr. Dawson," she replied with unexpected wryness. "I believe discomfort is preferable to death." Despite himself, Wade felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "Call me Wade. If we're sharing a cabin, Mr. Dawson is too formal." "Wade, then," she said, testing the name. "And I'm Faith, not Mrs. Keller." At the livery, Wade conferred with the owner, Sam Tucker, about a suitable mount for a novice rider. They settled on a gentle dun mare named Sadie who, according to Sam, had the patience of a saint and the surest foot this side of the Rockies. While Sam saddled both horses, Wade gave Faith a crash course in basic horsemanship, showing her how to hold the reins, how to signal the horse to walk, trot, and stop, and how to sit properly in the saddle to avoid unnecessary soreness. "Keep your back straight but not stiff," he instructed, standing beside her as she sat atop Sadie in the livery yard. "Move with the horse, don't fight against her rhythm." Faith listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration as she practiced the commands. Sadie responded beautifully, seeming to understand her rider's inexperience. "She likes you," Wade observed as the mare nuzzled Faith's hand. Faith smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and momentarily overshadowed the bruising. "The feeling is mutual. She's very patient with me." They packed their supplies into saddlebags, securing them carefully to both horses. Wade had been right about leaving before noon. The sun was high overhead by the time they were ready to depart. As they mounted their horses at the edge of town, Wade noticed Faith wince slightly as she settled into the saddle. "We'll take it slow," he assured her. "Tell me if you need to rest." Faith nodded, determination written across her face. "I'm ready." They rode out of Bozeman, heading west, toward the foothills that eventually gave way to the more dramatic Gallatin Range. Wade kept their pace deliberate, occasionally glancing back to check on Faith. She sat upright in the saddle, occasionally shifting uncomfortably but never complaining. The bruises on her face stood out starkly in the bright sunlight, a visible reminder of why they were making this journey. As the town receded behind them and the open country stretched before them, Wade felt the familiar sense of relief that always came with leaving civilization behind. But this time, It was tempered by an acute awareness of the woman riding beside him, a woman who had upended his carefully isolated existence in less than 24 hours. They rode in companionable silence for the most part, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a hawk overhead the only interruptions to the quiet. The landscape gradually changed as they continued westward, the open plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines and quaking aspens, their leaves shimmering gold in the autumn sunlight. "It's beautiful," Faith said softly, breaking the silence as they paused atop a rise to rest the horses. "I've never been this far from town before." Wade looked at the land spread before them, trying to see it through her eyes. The distant mountains, capped with early snow, the vast sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it, the rippling grasslands interspersed with stands of timber. It was beautiful, he supposed, though he'd long ago stopped noticing such things. "Gets prettier the farther we go," he offered. "There's a creek near my cabin, clear as glass and full of trout." Faith's eyes brightened at this. "I love fishing. My father taught me when I was a girl before we moved to Helena." Wade found himself curious about her past, a feeling he usually avoided when it came to other people. "Where did you grow up?" "Oregon Territory, in a small settlement near Portland," she replied, absent-mindedly stroking Sadie's neck. "My father was a schoolteacher. He wanted the same for me, but then I met Edward." Her voice trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. "We were married 8 years." Wade nodded, unsure what to say. Condolences felt hollow, and questions about her husband might bring more pain. Instead, he changed the subject. "We should keep moving. There's a good spot to camp about 2 hours ahead by a stream. We'll stop there for the night and reach the cabin tomorrow afternoon." They continued their journey, the shadows lengthening as the afternoon wore on. Wade noticed Faith beginning to slump slightly in her saddle, fatigue evident in the line of her shoulders. "Not much farther," he encouraged her. "How are you holding up?" Faith straightened, offering a brave smile that didn't quite hide her exhaustion. "I'm fine. Just not accustomed to so many hours in the saddle." Wade knew she was understating her discomfort. Between her injuries and her inexperience with riding, she had to be in considerable pain. He respected her too much to call her on the pretense, however. When they finally reached the camping spot, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, sheltered by a stand of pines, Faith dismounted with a barely suppressed groan, her legs buckling slightly. Wade was at her side in an instant, steadying her with a hand under her elbow. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I seem to be making a habit of nearly collapsing in front of you. No shame in being tired," Wade said gruffly, helping her to a fallen log where she could sit. "Rest. I'll take care of the horses and set up camp." As Wade unsaddled the horses and led them to the stream to drink, he found himself watching Faith from the corner of his eye. She sat quietly, her posture gradually relaxing as she took in their surroundings. There was a peacefulness to her that Wade found compelling despite everything she'd been through. She radiated a quiet strength that he admired. Once the horses were settled, Wade set about making camp with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to living in the wilderness. He gathered firewood, built a small fire pit ringed with stones, and soon had a cheerful blaze going as the evening air grew cooler. "Can I help?" Faith asked, moving to join him by the fire. Wade shook his head. "Everything's under control. You should rest." Faith's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "Mr. Dawson, Wade, I may be inexperienced with horses and camping, but I'm not helpless. Please don't treat me as if I am." Wade was taken aback by her sudden assertion. "I didn't mean, I know," she sighed, her expression softening. "You're being kind and I appreciate it, but I need to be useful. These past few days, ever since Edward," she swallowed hard. "I've felt so powerless. Please don't add to that feeling, even with the best of intentions." Wade studied her for a moment, seeing beyond the bruises to the proud, capable woman beneath. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough, you can help with dinner. I've got coffee, beans, and jerky in my saddlebag. Not exactly a feast, but it'll keep us going." Faith's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'll fetch the saddlebags." As they worked together preparing their simple meal, Wade found himself oddly comfortable with Faith's presence. She moved with quiet efficiency, asking practical questions about the coffee pot and how to properly bank the fire, but otherwise respecting the companionable silence that had developed between them. Night fell quickly in the mountains, the sky transforming from deep blue to black velvet studded with stars. After they'd eaten, Faith gazed upward, wonder evident on her face. "I've never seen so many stars," she breathed. "In town, the lamps obscure most of them." Wade followed her gaze upward. "Out here you can see the whole sky. In winter they seem close enough to touch." "Do you ever get lonely?" Faith asked suddenly, her eyes still on the stars. "Living out here by yourself, I mean." The question caught Wade off guard. No one had asked him about loneliness in years, perhaps because the answer seemed so obvious to those who knew him, or perhaps because no one had cared enough to ask. "Got used to my own company a long time ago," he said finally. "Prefer it, mostly." Faith looked at him then, her gaze searching. "Mostly, but not always." Wade stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the darkness. "There are moments, winter nights mostly, when the snow piles up and the wind howls, but then I remember that people bring complications." "And pain," Faith added softly, understanding in her voice. "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" Wade felt the old, familiar tightness in his chest. Long time ago. Faith didn't press, and Wade was grateful for her perception. Instead, she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill and said, "Thank you for helping me, Wade. I know it wasn't an easy decision, bringing a stranger to your sanctuary." "Get some rest," Wade replied, unable to address her gratitude directly. "Tomorrow's ride will be harder, more uphill." He showed her how to make a bed from the blankets they'd brought, creating a reasonably comfortable pallet near the fire. Wade would take his own rest on the other side of the flames, maintaining a respectful distance. As Faith settled into her makeshift bed, wincing slightly as her bruised body met the hard ground, Wade found himself wishing he could offer her more comfort. His cabin, while rustic, would at least provide a proper bed and shelter from the elements. "Good night, Wade," Faith murmured, her voice already heavy with exhaustion. "Night," he responded, adding after a moment's hesitation, "Sleep well." Long after Faith's breathing had evened into the rhythm of sleep, Wade remained awake, watching the fire die down to embers. He'd spent 15 years avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself, numbing the pain of his past with isolation and hard work. Yet in less than a day, this woman with her bruised face and unwavering dignity had somehow breached walls he'd thought impenetrable. As he finally stretched out on his own blanket, stars wheeling overhead, Wade told himself it was temporary. He would keep Faith safe until the marshal dealt with the men who had killed her husband, and then she would return to civilization where she belonged. His life would resume its solitary course, unchanged. But as sleep finally claimed him, Wade Dawson knew, with a certainty that troubled his dreams, that nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn broke clear and cold, the first pale light filtering through the pines as Wade stirred the fire back to life. Faith was still sleeping, her honey-colored hair spread across her blanket, one hand curled beneath her chin. In sleep, with the tension gone from her face, the bruises seemed even more stark and cruel against her pale skin. Wade moved quietly, preparing coffee, and a simple breakfast of hardtack softened in the hot liquid. The familiar routine of breaking camp helped settle the unease he'd felt since waking, the strange sense that he was standing at a crossroads without knowing which path led forward. Faith woke as the coffee began to bubble, sitting up with a small gasp of pain as her stiff muscles protested. "Morning," Wade greeted her, handing over a steaming cup. "Sleep all right." Faith accepted the coffee with a grateful smile, though Wade could see the night on the hard ground had taken its toll. "Well enough, thank you. Is there somewhere I might have some privacy before we set out?" Wade gestured toward a thicket of serviceberry bushes a short distance away. "Through there, streams just beyond if you want to wash up, water's cold but clean." When Faith returned some time later, her hair was neatly braided and her face freshly washed, though Wade noted she moved with even more caution than the previous day. She accepted the hardtack he offered without comment, eating methodically while gazing at the mountains that loomed closer today. "How far to your cabin?" she asked as they began saddling the horses. "Should reach it by mid-afternoon if we keep a steady pace," Wade replied, adjusting Copper's cinch. "Trail gets steeper from here on. Narrower, too. Stay close behind me and let Sadie pick her way." "She knows what she's doing, even if you don't." Faith nodded, her expression determined despite the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Wade helped her mount, pretending not to notice her wince of pain as she settled into the saddle. The morning unfolded into one of those perfect autumn days that sometimes grace the Montana mountains' crisp air filled with the scent of pine. A sky so intensely blue it seemed unreal, and a silence broken only by the soft thud of hooves on the needle-strewn path and the occasional call of a jay. They rode single file now, the trail narrowing as it wound upward through increasingly dense forest. Wade kept a close eye on Faith, watching for signs that she needed to rest. Though she never complained, he could see the ride was taking its toll. Her shoulders were rigid with tension, and occasionally her hand would drift to her side, suggesting injuries beyond the visible ones on her face. Around midday, they emerged from the trees onto a high meadow dotted with late wildflowers. A stream meandered through its center, the water glinting silver in the sunlight. "We'll rest here," Wade announced, reining Copper to a halt. "Good water for the horses and a chance to stretch our legs." Faith practically melted with relief as Wade helped her dismount. Her legs buckled momentarily and she clutched his arm to steady herself. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I thought I was stronger than this." "You're doing fine," Wade assured her, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Most experienced riders would be feeling it after what you've been through." They led the horses to the stream, then found a flat rock where they could sit while the animals drank and grazed. Wade offered Faith jerky and dried apples from his saddlebag, which she accepted gratefully. "What will happen when we reach your cabin?" Faith asked after a while, her eyes on the distant peaks. "How long will we need to stay there?" Wade considered the question. "Depends on how quickly the marshal acts on Taylor's telegram. Might be a few days, might be weeks." "And you truly don't mind?" Faith turned to face him directly. Having a stranger disrupt your life for an indefinite period, Wade found himself unable to look away from her searching gaze. "Wouldn't have offered if I did." Faith studied him for a moment longer, then nodded as if she'd confirmed something to herself. "You're a good man, Wade Dawson, despite your efforts to appear otherwise." Wade felt a flush of discomfort at her assessment. "Don't go painting me as some kind of hero, Faith. I've got my reasons for helping you, and they ain't all noble." "Oh," one eyebrow arched in question, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her bruised face. Wade gestured vaguely toward her injuries. "Men who do that to women, who kill honest folks trying to do right. They need to be stopped, that's all there is to it." Faith's expression softened. "Justice, then, I can understand that." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I think there's more to you than that, Wade Dawson." Before Wade could respond, a distant rumble of thunder drew their attention to the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering over the highest peaks. "Storm's coming," Wade said, grateful for the change of subject. "We should get moving if we want to reach the cabin before it hits." They mounted up again, Wade noting with concern how Faith gritted her teeth against the pain as she settled into the saddle. The remainder of their journey was a race against the approaching storm, the trail growing steeper and more challenging as they climbed higher into the foothills. Faith followed Wade's instructions exactly, letting Sadie find her footing on the rocky path, trusting the mare's instincts. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as a small clearing came into view ahead, revealing a sturdy log cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a sight that made Wade frown in confusion until he remembered. "Dan Fisher," he explained to Faith as they approached. "Neighbor who keeps an eye on the place when I'm gone. Looks like he's been by to ready it for winter." As if summoned by his name, the cabin door opened to reveal a burly, bearded man of about 60, dressed in faded flannel and worn denim. "Dawson," he called, raising a hand in greeting. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Got your note about," he broke off as he caught sight of Faith, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Fisher," Wade nodded as they rode into the clearing. "Appreciate you looking in on the place." Dan's eyes hadn't left Faith, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern as he took in her bruised face. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "Dan Fisher. Didn't realize Dawson was bringing company." Wade dismounted quickly, moving to help Faith from her saddle before making introductions. "Dan, this is Mrs. Faith Keller. She'll be staying with me for a while. Faith, Dan Fisher, my nearest neighbor, though near is a relative term out here." Faith smiled politely, though Wade could feel her trembling slightly as she leaned against him for support. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Fisher." Dan's eyes darted between them, clearly burning with questions he was too polite to ask. "Likewise, Mrs. Keller." He turned to Wade. "Stocked your pantry, got the stove going. Figured you'd want a warm place after the ride. Should last till morning if you bank it right." "Thanks," Wade said, genuinely grateful. "We appreciate it." Dan nodded, gathering his hat and gloves. "Well, I'll be on my way then. Storm's coming in fast. You need anything, Dawson, you know where to find me." As Dan mounted his own horse and rode off, the rain began falling in earnest, driving them toward the shelter of the cabin. Wade helped Faith inside, then returned to tend to the horses, working quickly to unsaddle them and get them settled in the small lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north side. By the time he returned, soaked to the skin despite his oilskin coat, Faith was standing by the iron stove, her hands outstretched toward its warmth. She'd removed her damp cloak and hung it on a peg by the door, revealing the full extent of her travel-worn dress. Wade took a moment to see his cabin through her eyes. It was small but solidly built, with a main room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living area, plus a single bedroom partitioned off at the back. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently cold and dark since the stove provided adequate heat. The furnishings were simple and utilitarian: a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf loaded with more volumes than most would expect, a comfortable but worn armchair near the fireplace, and various practical items hanging from hooks or stored on open shelves. "It's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious about the cabin's plainness. Faith turned to him, her expression warm despite her obvious exhaustion. "It's wonderful, solid, and safe." She gestured around the room. "And far more comfortable than I expected. You have quite a collection of books." Wade shrugged, removing his wet coat and hat. "Winter nights are long up here. Reading passes the time." Thunder crashed overhead, and rain pattered against the windows with increasing intensity. Wade moved to the stove, adding another log to ensure it would burn through the afternoon. "You should get out of those damp clothes," he said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. "Bedroom's through there. I'll bring your things in from the saddlebags." Faith nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I could use some time to refresh myself." While Faith changed, Wade brought in their supplies, arranging them neatly on the table. He put coffee on to boil, then checked his food stores, pleased to see that Dan had indeed stocked them well: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and even some preserved fruits. When Faith emerged from the bedroom some time later, Wade almost didn't recognize her. She changed into one of the simple dresses they'd purchased in Bozeman, a practical garment of deep blue calico, and had loosened her braid, allowing her honey-colored hair to fall in waves around her shoulders. She'd also washed away the dust of travel, revealing skin that would have been fair and lovely if not for the bruising. "Better?" Wade asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. "Much," Faith said with a small smile, accepting the coffee, "though I must look a fright with these bruises." Wade found himself shaking his head. "You look." He paused, unused to paying compliments and unsure how to continue. Faith saved him from his awkwardness by changing the subject. "Your friend Mr. Fisher seems nice. Does he live nearby?" "About 3 miles east," Wade replied, grateful for the shift. "Keeps to himself mostly, like me. We help each other out when needed, but don't socialize much." Faith nodded, sipping her coffee as she gazed around the cabin. The rain continued to fall heavily outside, drumming on the roof and casting the interior in a cozy, muted light. "You'll take the bedroom," Wade said, heading off any potential argument. "I'll sleep out here by the stove." To his surprise, Faith didn't protest. "Thank you. I admit I'm looking forward to sleeping in a real bed after last night on the ground." Wade busied himself preparing a simple dinner from his store's beans with salt pork, cornbread baked in the cast iron skillet, and stewed apples for sweetness. Faith insisted on helping despite her fatigue, setting the table with his mismatched plates and utensils, then slicing the cornbread when it was done. They ate in companionable silence, the storm raging outside creating a strange sense of intimacy within the cabin's sturdy walls. Wade found himself watching Faith when she wasn't looking, the graceful movement of her hands, the thoughtful expression in her eyes as she gazed into the fire, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Tell me about Edward," Wade said suddenly, surprising himself with the request. "If you don't mind talking about him." Faith looked up, clearly startled by the question. For a moment Wade thought he'd overstepped, but then her expression softened into something between sorrow and fondness. "Edward was kind," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Gentle in a way that's rare in men. He loved books and music and ideas. He believed in doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy or popular." She paused, a sad smile touching her lips. "We met when I was teaching at the school in Helena. He came to deliver some banking documents and stayed to hear my students recite their lessons. Afterward, he told me I had a gift for teaching. We were married 6 months later." "You loved him," Wade said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," Faith confirmed. "Very much. We wanted children, but—" She shook her head slightly. "It wasn't to be. Instead, we filled our lives with books and music and friends." Her expression hardened. "Until Victor Blackstone and his associates decided their greed was worth more than a good man's life." Wade nodded, understanding the anger that underlay her grief. "The marshal will bring them to justice." "I hope so," Faith said, though doubt shadowed her voice. "They're powerful men in Helena. Money buys influence, and they have plenty of both. Truth has power too," Wade said quietly. "Especially when spoken by someone with courage." Faith looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you for believing me. Not everyone would." Later, as the evening deepened into night and the storm gradually moved eastward, leaving behind a gentle patter of rain, Wade prepared a makeshift bed for himself near the stove. Faith had retired to the bedroom, clearly exhausted from their journey and the emotional strain of the past few days. Lying on his bedroll, listening to the dying storm and the occasional pop from the stove, Wade reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, he'd been alone in Bozeman, planning a simple tracking job. Now he was sharing his private sanctuary with a woman he barely knew, involved in a dangerous situation that could bring violent men to his doorstep. Yet despite the potential complications, Wade couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Faith Keller's quiet dignity in the face of loss and danger had awakened something in him that had been dormant for 15 years, a desire to protect, to help, to connect with another human being. As sleep finally claimed him, Wade's last thought was that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for tonight, Faith was safe, and that knowledge brought him a peace he hadn't expected to find again. Morning arrived with a clarity that only follows a cleansing storm. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the simple beauty of Wade's rustic home. He woke early, as was his habit, and rekindled the stove before stepping outside to check on the horses and assess any damage from the storm. The mountain air was crisp and pine-scented, the world washed clean by the night's rain. Copper and Sadie nickered softly in greeting as Wade entered the lean-to stable, their warm breath visible in the cool morning air. After ensuring they had fresh water and feed, Wade surveyed his small property. The cabin stood on a gentle slope, backed by dense pine forest and fronted by a clearing that offered views across a steep valley to the mountains beyond. A small creek gurgled nearby, swollen from the rain but clear as glass. Wade's nearest neighbor, Dan Fisher, lived 3 miles to the east, and the closest semblance of a town was a good day's ride away. It was isolated by most standards, but Wade had always found peace in the solitude, until now. The presence of Faith Keller in his cabin changed everything, not just the practical arrangements of daily life, but something deeper that Wade wasn't quite ready to examine. Having another person in his space, depending on him for protection, disrupted the careful emotional balance he'd maintained for 15 years. When Wade returned to the cabin, he found Faith already awake and moving about the kitchen area. She dressed in another of her simple dresses, this one a warm brown that complemented her honey-colored hair, which she'd plaited into a single braid that hung down her back. "Good morning," she greeted him with a smile that, despite the persistent bruising, lit up her entire face. "I hope you don't mind I found the coffee and put some on to boil." "Not at all," Wade replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Make yourself at home." Faith poured coffee into 2 mugs, handing one to Wade. "How are the horses?" "Content enough," Wade said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Storm didn't cause any damage I can see." They settled into a surprisingly comfortable domestic routine, with Faith preparing a simple breakfast of flapjacks from the flour and dried eggs in Wade's pantry, while he brought in more firewood and checked his water supply. They ate at the small table, the morning sun casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden surface. "What happens now?" Faith asked as they finished their meal. "While we wait for word from the marshal," Wade considered the question, "we keep our heads down, stay close to the cabin. I need to hunt today, get some fresh meat for the days ahead. You'll be safe here while I'm gone." Faith nodded, though Wade detected a flicker of unease in her expression at the thought of being left alone. "How long will you be gone?" "Few hours at most," Wade assured her. "Got my rifle and plenty of ammunition by the door if you need it, though it's unlikely you will. No one comes up this way without good reason." "I'm not afraid," Faith said, lifting her chin slightly, "and I'm not helpless. My father taught me to use a rifle when I was a girl." Wade found himself respecting her determination. "Good to know. While I'm gone, you might want to rest. Those injuries need time to heal." Faith's hand drifted unconsciously to her bruised cheek. "They look worse than they feel now. I'm more concerned about." She hesitated, then continued more quietly, "About what happens when the marshal finds these men." "Will I have to return to Helena to testify?" The question hung between them, carrying implications neither was ready to address directly. If Faith had to return to Helena, would she come back afterward? Should she? And why did the thought of her leaving cause an uncomfortable tightness in Wade's chest? "Let's not worry about that yet," Wade said, rising to clear away their breakfast dishes. "One day at a time." After breakfast, Wade prepared for his hunting expedition, checking his rifle and gathering the necessary supplies. Faith watched him from the doorway as he saddled Copper, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "Be careful," she said as he mounted. Wade nodded, unexpectedly touched by her concern. "Always am. Should be back by mid-afternoon. Bar the door while I'm gone." As he rode away, Wade glanced back to see Faith still standing in the doorway, a solitary figure framed by the rustic cabin, her honey-colored braid gleaming in the sunlight. Something about the image stayed with him as he rode into the forest, a strange sense that he was leaving behind something precious rather than merely fulfilling a practical need for food. The hunting was good that day. By early afternoon, Wade had bagged a young buck, field-dressed it efficiently, and secured the meat across Copper's back for the return journey. As he rode homeward through the dappled forest light, his thoughts continually returned to Faith. Was she comfortable? Had she managed to rest? Was she worried about being alone? The sight of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney filled Wade with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Someone was waiting for him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 15 long years. Faith must have heard Copper's approach, for she appeared in the doorway as Wade rode into the clearing, her face lighting up with a smile that made his heart stutter in his chest. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "And successful, I see." Wade dismounted, leading Copper to the stable. Got enough venison to last us a week or more. You doing all right? Faith nodded, following him to help with the horse and the meat. Yes, I rested as you suggested, then did some tidying. I hope you don't mind. Wade glanced at her sharply. You don't need to be cleaning up after me. I wanted to feel useful, Faith explained, helping him unload the deer. And honestly, your cabin is remarkably well kept for a bachelor living alone. I merely organized a few things in the pantry. Together, they carried the meat to the cabin, where Wade set about preparing portions for smoking and immediate cooking. Faith worked alongside him, following his instructions with the careful attention she'd shown during their ride. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing slender forearms and the fading yellow-green of bruises that circled her wrists like macabre bracelets. Wade found his gaze returning to those bruises repeatedly, anger simmering deep in his chest at the men who had marked her so carelessly, as if her body were something to be used and discarded rather than cherished. They held me down, Faith said quietly, noticing his attention. When I tried to run, Wade's hands stilled on the knife he was using. You don't have to talk about it. I know, Faith replied, her voice steady despite the painful memories. But sometimes speaking the truth aloud helps diminish its power over you. She continued working as she spoke, her movements deliberate and precise. There were 3 of them. They came to our house the day after Edward's funeral, demanding his papers. When I told them I didn't have what they wanted, her voice faltered briefly. They searched the house, destroying everything in their path. When they couldn't find what they were looking for, they decided to teach me a lesson. Wade's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles were white. Did they? No, Faith interrupted, understanding his unspoken question. Not that. Victor Blackstone likes his violence to be visible, a warning to others. He held me while James Harrington hit me. Then they told me they'd be back to finish the job if I spoke to anyone about Edward's discoveries. The matter-of-fact way she related this brutality only deepened Wade's anger and admiration. Many would have been broken by such treatment, yet here she stood, helping prepare meat for smoking, her dignity intact. They won't touch you again, Wade promised, the words emerging with a ferocity that surprised him. Not while I draw breath. Faith looked up at him, her blue eyes meeting his with startling directness. I believe you, Wade, that's why I'm here. The simple statement of trust affected Wade more deeply than he could have anticipated. How long had it been since anyone had depended on him this way, since anyone had looked at him with such faith in his protection? The remainder of the day passed in quiet industry as they smoked most of the venison and prepared a hearty stew with some of the fresh meat. As dusk approached, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Wade built up the fire in the hearth, deciding the evening was cool enough to warrant its cheerful blaze rather than just the heat from the stove. Faith sat in Wade's armchair, a book from his shelf open on her lap, though Wade noticed she seemed more absorbed in watching the flames than reading. The firelight softened the bruising on her face, giving her an ethereal quality that made it difficult for him to look away. You have an impressive library, she remarked, gesturing to the shelf. Thoreau, Emerson, Shakespeare, not what most would expect from a solitary cowboy, Wade shrugged, slightly embarrassed by her observation. Books are good company, don't ask questions, don't need answers. Unlike people, Faith said with a small smile. Is that why you prefer this isolation, Wade, to avoid questions? The directness of her query caught him off guard. Most people who knew Wade had learned not to pry into his past, accepting his reticence as part of his character. But Faith Keller, it seemed, was not most people. Maybe, he conceded, poking at the fire to avoid meeting her eyes, or maybe I just got tired of people's expectations. Faith was quiet for a moment, considering his words. You lost someone, she said finally. You mentioned it briefly on the trail. Would you tell me about them, if it's not too painful to discuss? Wade stared into the flames, feeling the familiar ache that always accompanied thoughts of his past. He rarely spoke of it, never, in fact, in the last decade. Yet something about Faith's gentle inquiry, her own willingness to share her painful experiences, made him consider breaking his long silence. My wife, he said after a long pause, his voice rough. "Caroline and our daughter, Emma, 15 years ago." Faith closed her book, giving him her full attention but not pressing for more, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "I was working as a ranch foreman near Cheyenne," Wade continued, the words coming slowly. "Good job, good pay. We had a small house on the property. Caroline was. She was everything. Bright, kind, loved to laugh. Emma had just turned 3, had her mother's eyes and my stubborn chin, according to Caroline." He paused, gathering himself to say aloud what he had contained in silence for so many years. There was an outbreak of scarlet fever. "Swept through the area like wildfire. I was away, delivering horses to a buyer in Colorado, by the time I got back." Wade's voice threatened to break, and he cleared his throat roughly. "By the time I got back, they were both gone, buried side by side under a cottonwood tree." Faith made a soft sound of sympathy but didn't interrupt, allowing him to continue. "Couldn't stay there after. Couldn't bear to see that tree, that empty house, so I drifted, worked my way north, taking whatever jobs came my way, eventually found this place, bought it with saved wages. Been here 8 years now." The silence that followed his story was heavy with unspoken emotion. Wade hadn't expected the relief that came with finally speaking of Caroline and Emma aloud, as if giving voice to their memory somehow honored them in a way his silent grief had not. "Thank you for telling me," Faith said softly. "They sound like they were wonderful." "They were," Wade agreed, his throat tight. "And you've been alone ever since," Faith observed, not a question but a gentle acknowledgement of his chosen isolation. Wade nodded, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "Seemed easier that way. Can't lose what you don't have." Faith's expression held understanding rather than pity, a distinction Wade appreciated deeply. "I understand that impulse. After Edward died, my first thought was that I would never allow myself to care for anyone again. The pain was too great." "What changed your mind?" Wade asked. Faith smiled slightly, the firelight catching the gold in her honey-colored hair. "I haven't entirely changed it. But I've begun to wonder if protecting ourselves from pain also shields us from joy. If in building walls to keep out grief, we also keep out everything that makes life worth living." Her words struck Wade with unexpected force. Had he been merely existing these past 15 years rather than truly living? The comfortable routine of his solitary life suddenly seemed less like peace and more like hiding. Before he could respond, Faith yawned, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. "I'm sorry, it's been a long day." "You should rest," Wade said, grateful for the change of subject. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the property if you're feeling up to it." Faith nodded, rising from the chair. "I'd like that." She hesitated at the bedroom door, turning back to face him. "Thank you, Wade. Not just for the shelter and protection, but for sharing your story with me. I know it wasn't easy." After she'd gone, Wade remained by the fire, watching the flames gradually die down to embers. Faith's words echoed in his mind, challenging the careful isolation he'd built around himself. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that loneliness was preferable to loss, that emotional distance was strength rather than fear. Now, with Faith's bruised but beautiful face appearing in his thoughts, Wade wondered if he'd been wrong all along. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural, as if Faith had always been part of Wade's life at the cabin. Each morning they rose with the sun, sharing coffee and breakfast before tending to the necessary chores, caring for the horses, gathering firewood, maintaining the cabin and its surroundings. Wade taught Faith about life in the mountains, showing her how to identify edible plants, how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the weather in the color of the sunset. For her part, Faith brought a warmth to the cabin that had been missing since Wade built it. She arranged wildflowers in an old jar on the table, reorganized the pantry for greater efficiency, and filled the quiet evening hours with conversation and occasional reading aloud from Wade's books, her clear voice bringing the words to life in a way he'd never experienced when reading alone. The bruises on her face gradually faded from angry purple to yellowish green, revealing the natural beauty that had been masked by violence. Wade found himself increasingly distracted by small details, the graceful curve of her neck as she bent over a book, the way sunlight caught in her hair, the sound of her laughter when something genuinely amused her. A week after their arrival at the cabin, Wade took Faith to his favorite spot on the property, a small clearing beside the creek where trout could often be seen flashing in the clear water. The autumn day was perfect, warm sunshine tempered by a cool breeze that rustled through the pines and aspens. "It's beautiful," Faith said, turning in a slow circle to take in the view. "So peaceful," Wade nodded, watching her rather than the scenery. "Good fishing, too. You mentioned your father taught you." Faith's face brightened at the memory. "He did. We used to spend hours by the streams near our home in Oregon." She looked hopefully at Wade. "Do you have fishing gear?" Wade produced 2 simple fishing poles from behind a nearby tree where he'd stashed them earlier in the day, planning this surprise. "Made these this morning while you were gathering herbs." The delight on Faith's face was worth the effort he'd put into crafting the poles and gathering bait. They spent the afternoon by the creek, sometimes talking, sometimes lapsing into comfortable silence as they watched their lines in the water. Faith proved to be a patient angler, and her triumphant smile when she landed a good-sized trout made Wade's heart beat faster. "I did it," she exclaimed, laughing as the fish flopped on the bank. "You certainly did," Wade agreed, helping her secure the trout. "That's dinner sorted." By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing. They worked together to clean and prepare the fish, then cooked it over the fire with herbs Faith had gathered earlier. "This is perfect," Faith said as they ate at the small table, the windows open to admit the cool evening breeze. "I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful." Wade understood exactly what she meant. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together and the potential danger still lurking in Helena, these days with Faith had brought him a contentment he'd thought forever beyond his reach. "Faith," he began, then hesitated, unsure how to continue. She looked up, her blue eyes questioning. "Yes, have you thought about, after?" Wade asked, the words coming awkwardly. "Once the marshal deals with Blackstone and the others, what will you do?" The question had been weighing on him more heavily with each passing day. Faith's presence in his life was temporary, a circumstance born of necessity rather than choice. Once the danger passed, she would return to civilization, to the life she'd built in Helena or perhaps somewhere new. The thought of his cabin returning to its former silence, of mornings without her smile and evenings without her voice, created an ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. Faith set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "I've been considering that question. I can't return to Helena, too many painful memories. I thought perhaps I might go to Oregon where I grew up. My parents are gone, but I have cousins there." "Oregon," Wade repeated, trying to keep his disappointment from showing. Oregon was far a journey of weeks, perhaps months. A journey she would make alone, disappearing from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. "It's just an idea," Faith added, watching his face closely. "I haven't decided anything." Wade nodded, unable to express the turmoil her potential departure created within him. How had this woman, in just over a week, become so essential to his peace? He'd spent 15 years convincing himself he was better off alone, yet the thought of returning to that solitude now seemed unbearable. Before either could say more, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle propped against the wall. "Stay inside," he told Faith, his voice tense. "Bar the door behind me." Faith's face had paled, but she nodded, rising to follow his instructions as he stepped outside, rifle in hand. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the clearing, making it difficult to identify the approaching rider. Wade positioned himself on the cabin's small porch, rifle raised and ready. As the rider emerged from the trees, Wade relaxed slightly, recognizing the broad-shouldered figure of Dan Fisher on his sturdy mountain pony. "Fisher," Wade called, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside. "Bit late for a social call." Dan reined his horse to a stop a few yards from the cabin. Not social Dawson got news. His eyes flicked to the cabin door behind Wade. For both of you, Wade nodded, turning to knock softly on the door. It's Fisher, says he has news. The door opened cautiously, revealing Faith's worried face. When she saw Dan, she stepped onto the porch beside Wade, unconsciously moving close to his side. Mr. Fisher, she greeted him with a composure that belied the tension Wade could feel in her body. What brings you here at this hour? Dan removed his hat, twisting it in his weathered hands. Rode into town yesterday for supplies. Sheriff Taylor asked me to bring you a message. He reached into his coat pocket, producing a folded paper. Telegram came for you, Dawson, from the U.S. Marshal in Helena. Wade took the paper, unfolding it with fingers that weren't quite steady. Faith pressed closer, reading over his shoulder in the fading light. Blackstone and Harrington arrested Stop Potter, deceased resisting arrest. Stop evidence found confirming banking fraud and murder of Edward Keller. Stop Mrs. Keller testimony required Helena in 2 weeks' time. Stop safe passage guaranteed. Stop Marshal. J. Williams. Faith's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the clearing. Wade felt her hand grab his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. It's over, she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. They're really caught. Potter's dead, Wade noted, rereading the telegram. Other two will hang for murder if the evidence is solid. Dan cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. Sheriff also sent word that the stage comes through Bozeman in 10 days, said to tell Mrs. Keller she could take it to Helena if she wishes. 10 days. The time frame hung in the air between them, suddenly making their peaceful existence at the cabin feel acutely temporary. In 10 days, Faith would leave for Helena. After her testimony, she would likely continue to Oregon, as she'd mentioned earlier, and Wade would be alone again. Thank you for bringing this news, Mr. Fisher, Faith said, her voice admirably steady despite the slight tremor Wade could feel through her hand on his arm. We're very grateful, Dan nodded, replacing his hat. Glad to help, madam. Good news about those men being caught. Justice being served and all that. He turned to Wade. I'll be heading back now. Trail's tricky in the dark, but the moon's bright enough. Wade stepped forward, extending his hand to the older man. Appreciate the ride, Dan. Be careful going back. After Dan had disappeared into the growing darkness, Wade and Faith remained on the porch, the telegram still clutched in Wade's hand. The night was settling around them, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky, crickets beginning their evening chorus from the surrounding wilderness. We should go inside, Wade said finally, aware of the cooling night air. Get some light to read this properly. Faith nodded, but neither moved immediately. There was a sense that crossing the threshold would mean acknowledging the change this news brought, that their time together now had a definite endpoint. Inside, Wade lit the lamps while Faith stoked the fire, the familiar domestic routine now tinged with a new awareness of its impermanence. They sat at the table, rereading the telegram in the warm lamplight. 2 weeks, Faith said softly. I need to be in Helena in 2 weeks to testify. I'll take you, Wade said immediately. To Bozeman for the stage, then all the way to Helena if you want. Make sure you get there safely. Faith looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. That's very kind, but not necessary. The marshal says safe passage is guaranteed. I'm taking you, Wade repeated, his tone brooking no argument. All the way to Helena. Make sure those men face justice for what they did. What he didn't say, couldn't say, was that he wanted every possible moment with her before she continued on to Oregon and out of his life forever. Faith reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Thank you, Wade, for everything. Her voice caught slightly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me that night in the saloon. Wade turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. You'd have found another way. You're stronger than you think, Faith Keller. They sat that way for a long moment, hands linked across the table, the telegram between them marking both an end to danger and the beginning of a separation neither seemed eager to acknowledge directly. 10 days, Faith said finally. We have 10 days before the stage comes through Bozeman. Wade nodded, his thumb unconsciously tracing circles on the back of her hand. What would you like to do with them? Faith's smile was tinged with sadness. Live them fully, I think. Enjoy this peace while it lasts. That night, as Wade lay on his bedroll near the stove, listening to the soft sounds of Faith's breathing from the bedroom, he confronted the truth he'd been avoiding since she'd entered his life. Despite all his efforts to maintain emotional distance, despite the walls he'd built around his heart after losing Caroline and Emma, he had fallen in love with Faith Keller. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a bittersweet clarity. He loved her courage, her intelligence, her quiet strength in the face of adversity. He loved the way she moved through his cabin as if she belonged there, the sound of her voice reading poetry by firelight, the gentle determination with which she approached every task. And in 10 days she would leave. Wade stared at the ceiling, considering his options. He could tell her how he felt, ask her to stay with him rather than continuing to Oregon. But what kind of life could he offer her? His isolated cabin was a far cry from the civilized existence she'd known in Helena. No neighbors. No society, just wilderness and a man whose heart had been frozen for 15 years. Or he could remain silent, help her reach Helena safely, and then return to his solitude, carrying the memory of these days like a precious but painful treasure. Neither option brought him peace as he finally drifted into troubled sleep, dreams filled with honey-colored hair and blue eyes that seemed to see into his soul. The following days passed with a strange mixture of joy and melancholy. True to her word, Faith seemed determined to live each moment fully, approaching every day with enthusiasm that both delighted and pained Wade. They fished in the creek, rode the horses through the surrounding forest, gathered late-season berries, and in the evenings sat by the fire talking long into the night. Faith shared stories of her childhood in Oregon, of her years teaching in Helena, of her life with Edward. Wade, in turn, found himself speaking more openly about his past than he had in 15 years, telling Faith about his own childhood on a farm in Missouri, about meeting Caroline at a harvest dance, about Emma's first steps and first words. "She sounds wonderful," Faith said softly, after Wade described how 3-year-old Emma had solemnly presented him with a wildflower bouquet on his birthday. "She had your heart." "She did," Wade agreed, his throat tight with emotion that was more bittersweet than painful for the first time in years. "Caroline used to say Emma could wrap me around her little finger with just one smile." Faith smiled, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. "I can imagine." "You have a gentle heart beneath that stern exterior, Wade Dawson." Wade looked away, uncomfortable with her assessment. "Not many would agree with you there." "Because you don't let them see it," Faith said simply. "You've built walls to protect yourself from further pain." "I understand that impulse all too well." The conversation shifted then, but Faith's words stayed with Wade, challenging the careful isolation he'd constructed around himself. Was she right? Had his self-imposed solitude been less about peace and more about fear? 5 days before Faith was due to leave, they rode to a high meadow that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. The autumn colors were at their peak, aspens glowing gold against the deep green of the pines. Underbrush turned crimson and russet, the whole landscape afire with color beneath the clear blue sky. They dismounted at the edge of the meadow, allowing the horses to graze while they walked toward a large boulder that offered a natural seat. "It's breathtaking," Faith said, turning in a slow circle to take in the panoramic view. "Like something from a painting." Wade watched her rather than the scenery, memorizing the way the sunlight played in her honey-colored hair, now fully loose around her shoulders, the way her blue eyes widened with delight at the beauty surrounding them, the graceful movement of her hands as she gestured toward a distant peak. "Beautiful," he agreed, though he wasn't referring to the landscape. Faith turned, catching his gaze, a slight flush coloring her cheeks as she realized he was watching her rather than the view. For a moment neither spoke, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "Wade," Faith began, her voice soft. Whatever she had been about to say was lost as a sudden movement in the nearby trees caught their attention. Wade tensed, stepping protectively in front of Faith as a large black bear emerged from the forest edge, its nose raised to catch their scent. "Don't move," Wade murmured, slowly reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "It's just curious for now." Faith remained perfectly still behind him, her breath coming in short, controlled gasps that told Wade she was frightened but managing it well. The bear, a good-sized male, dropped to all fours and ambled a few steps closer, still primarily curious rather than aggressive. Wade raised the rifle slightly, not aiming directly at the bear but prepared to fire if necessary. "Easy now," he called in a firm, steady voice. "Go on, get out of here." The bear paused, seeming to consider this new development. For a tense moment, Wade thought it might charge, but then it snorted once, turned and lumbered back into the forest, apparently deciding they weren't worth the trouble. Wade waited until the bear was well out of sight before lowering the rifle, his heart gradually slowing to its normal rhythm. He turned to find Faith pale but composed, her eyes wide but her posture steady. "You all right?" he asked, automatically checking her for signs of shock. Faith nodded, a slightly hysterical laugh escaping her lips. "I've never been so close to a bear before. It was terrifying and magnificent at the same time." Wade couldn't help but smile at her description. "That about sums it up. You did well, didn't panic, didn't run." "Most people's first instinct is to bolt, which is the worst thing you can do." "I trusted you would know what to do," Faith said simply. "You've faced worse than bears, I imagine." The straightforward faith in her statement touched Wade deeply. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him so completely? Since anyone had looked at him with such confidence in his abilities? "We should head back," he said, suddenly needing movement to dispel the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Don't want to push our luck with that fellow." As they rode back toward the cabin, Faith was unusually quiet, her expression thoughtful. Wade found himself wondering what she had been about to say before the bear interrupted them. Several times he thought she might return to it, but she remained silent on the subject, and Wade didn't press. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the comfortable routine they'd established, Wade caught Faith watching him with an intensity that made his heart race. But whatever thoughts were behind that gaze, she kept them to herself, and the evening passed much like the others had, with conversation, reading, and the quiet companionship that had become precious to both of them. 3 days before Faith was due to leave for Bozeman, the weather changed dramatically. Wade woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin's eaves and the distinctive hush that indicated falling snow. Opening the door, he was greeted by a world-transformed fat white flakes swirling through the air, already accumulating on the ground with more clearly on the way. "Early storm," he muttered, assessing the dark clouds that hung low over the mountains. "Going to be a bad one." Faith appeared beside him, wrapped in a shawl against the sudden cold. "Snow, already, it's only October. Mountains make their own weather," Wade explained, closing the door against the growing storm. "Early snow isn't uncommon, though this looks to be a heavy one." He busied himself adding wood to both the stove and the fireplace, ensuring they would have plenty of heat for what might be a prolonged cold spell. Faith, sensing the seriousness of the situation, began checking their food supplies, taking inventory of what they had on hand. "Will this delay our journey to Bozeman?" she asked finally, the question that had been hanging unspoken between them. Wade nodded, looking out the window at the steadily increasing snowfall. "If it keeps up like this, trails will be impassable for a few days at least. We'll have to wait it out." He expected Faith to show concern or disappointment at this news, but instead a strange expression crossed her face, almost relief, quickly masked by practical consideration. "Then we should prepare for a longer stay," she said, turning back to the pantry. "Make sure we have everything we need." The storm continued through the day and into the night, the wind driving snow against the cabin windows with growing force. By morning, drifts had formed against the north wall, and the clearing was blanketed in white. Wade fought his way through the deep snow to check on the horses in their shelter, ensuring they had plenty of feed and that the structure was holding against the storm's fury. When he returned, snow crusting his coat and hat, he found Faith had prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and coffee. She'd also rearranged the furniture slightly, moving Wade's armchair closer to the fireplace and creating a cozy nook where they could sit through the long storm-bound days ahead. "The horses are fine," Wade reported, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. "Shelter's holding well. Might be stuck here for a while, though. Snow's almost knee-deep in places and still coming down hard." Faith handed him a steaming mug of coffee. "Then we'll make the best of it. I found a deck of cards in the drawer. Do you play?" The storm lasted 3 days, 3 days of howling wind and snow that transformed the landscape into an unrecognizable white wilderness. Inside the cabin, Wade and Faith created their own world of warmth and companionship. They played cards, read aloud to each other from Wade's books, told stories of their respective childhoods, and prepared meals together from their carefully rationed supplies. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to die down, and the snow tapered to occasional flurries. The world outside the cabin windows was pristine and silent, the clearing and surrounding forest draped in a blanket of unmarred white. "It's beautiful," Faith said, standing at the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Like everything's been made new." Wade came to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body but not quite touching. "It'll make travel difficult. Trails will need time to clear, even after the snow stops completely." Faith turned to look at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "The stage to Helena," she said, realization dawning. "I'll miss it," Wade nodded slowly. "Afraid so. We can't safely make it to Bozeman in these conditions, not for several days at least, maybe longer, depending on how fast it melts." He expected disappointment, perhaps even anger at this complication to her plans. Instead, Faith's expression held a strange mixture of emotions: concern, certainly, but also something that looked almost like relief. "I should send word to the marshal," she said practically. "Let him know I'll be delayed but still intend to testify. Fisher might be able to get a message to town once the weather clears a bit more," Wade agreed. "But that still leaves us snowbound here for at least a few more days." Faith's gaze returned to the snow-covered landscape outside. "I find I don't mind that as much as perhaps I should. Is that terrible of me? To not mind this delay, even knowing how important my testimony is?" Wade studied her profile, the delicate curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows as she contemplated her conflicted feelings. In that moment, he wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms, to confess the feelings that had been growing within him since she'd entered his life. Instead, he said carefully, "It's human to want peace after what you've been through." "The testimony will happen just a bit later than planned." Faith turned back to him, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you for understanding, and for everything else, Wade. These weeks here, despite the circumstances that brought me, they've been healing in ways I didn't expect." That evening, with the storm finally past, and the night sky cleared to reveal a canopy of brilliant stars, they sat before the hearth sharing the last of Wade's whiskey. The cabin was warm and snug against the bitter cold outside, the firelight casting a golden glow over their faces as they talked quietly. "What will you do after Helena?" Wade asked, the question that had been burning inside him finally finding voice. "Still planning on Oregon." Faith looked into her glass, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. "I've been reconsidering that plan, actually." Wade's heart beat faster, though he kept his expression neutral. "Oh, Oregon is my past," Faith said slowly, choosing her words with care. "I left there as a girl. Going back feels like retreating somehow, like I'm running away rather than moving forward." "Where then?" Wade asked, hardly daring to hope for the answer he wanted to hear. Faith raised her eyes to meet his, and in their blue depths Wade saw a vulnerability that matched his own. "I've grown fond of Montana," she said softly. "The mountains, the forests, the changing seasons, there's a beauty here that speaks to me." Wade set his glass down, his mouth suddenly dry. "Montana's a big territory." "Yes," Faith agreed, her gaze steady on his face. "But there are parts of it that already feel like home." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with words unspoken but hovering on the edge of utterance. Wade found himself moving closer to her, drawn by an invisible force he no longer wanted to resist. "Faith," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not good with words, never have been, but these weeks with you—" He paused, struggling to express what was in his heart. "You've brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." Faith's eyes widened, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "What are you saying, Wade?" "I'm saying I don't want you to go to Oregon," Wade continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'm saying that the thought of this cabin without you in it is something I can't bear to consider. I'm saying—" He took a deep breath, crossing a threshold he'd thought forever close to him. "I'm saying I love you, Faith Keller." For one terrible moment, Faith was silent, and Wade felt the old, familiar panic rising within him, the certainty that he'd risked his heart only to have it broken again. But then Faith moved toward him, her hand reaching out to touch his face with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "Oh, Wade," she whispered, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I've been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. After Edward, I thought that part of my life was over. But then you found me, protected me, showed me that it's possible to begin again after loss." Her voice strengthened, becoming more certain. "I love you too, I have for days now, perhaps since that first night when you carried me to Martha Wilkins' room." Wade covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. "Stay with me," he said simply. "After Helena, after the trial. Come back here, make this place your home, make a life with me." Faith's smile was radiant despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll stay. This is where I belong now, with you." Wade pulled her gently into his arms, his heart thundering in his chest as she came willingly, fitting against him as if she'd been made to be there. For 15 years, he had avoided love like death itself, convinced that opening his heart again would only lead to more pain. But Faith's bruised face that first night in Bozeman had changed everything, awakening compassion, then admiration, then a love so powerful it had broken through walls he'd thought impenetrable. As he lowered his lips to hers in a first, tender kiss, Wade knew he was taking a risk. Life offered no guarantees against future loss. But in that moment, with Faith warm and real in his arms, he understood that true courage wasn't in avoiding pain, but in embracing love despite the risk, in choosing connection over isolation, in allowing himself to be vulnerable again. Outside, the snow-covered landscape glittered beneath the stars, beautiful and harsh and wild like love itself, demanding everything but offering even more in return. Inside the cabin, two people who had each known profound loss found in each other the courage to begin again, to build something new from the ashes of their pasts. It would be another week before the trails were passable enough for them to make the journey to Bozeman, and from there to Helena for Faith's testimony. The delay meant rescheduling the trial, but the marshal was accommodating, understanding that mountain weather was an uncontrollable force. In Helena, Faith testified with quiet dignity about her husband's discoveries and his subsequent murder. Her clear, unwavering account, combined with the evidence the marshal had uncovered, ensured that Victor Blackstone and James Harrington were convicted and sentenced to hang for their crimes. Justice, long delayed, was finally served. After the trial, Wade and Faith returned to Bozeman only long enough to purchase supplies and file marriage papers with the county clerk. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, Sheriff Taylor as witness, and the minister of Bozeman's small church officiating. Faith wore a new dress of deep blue that matched her eyes, and Wade wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago and rarely worn. Their wedding night was spent at Martha Wilkins' room above the general store, the same room where Wade had first brought Faith when she was injured and afraid. This time, they entered it together, as husband and wife, their future stretching before them like the vast Montana sky. The journey back to their cabin was filled with plans and possibilities. They would expand the structure come spring, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have. Wade would continue his work breaking horses and tracking, but would stay closer to home now that he had someone waiting for his return. Faith spoke of perhaps starting a small school for the children of the scattered families in the region, bringing education to those who had little access to formal learning. Winter settled over the mountains properly as November deepened, but the cabin that had once known only solitude was now filled with warmth and laughter, with love and the promise of new beginnings. Wade, who had once avoided love like death itself, now embraced it fully, grateful beyond words for the bruised face that had changed everything. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when they had first arrived at the cabin together, Wade stood in the doorway watching Faith chase their 3-year-old son Daniel through the expanded garden they had built together. Their daughter Caroline, just a year old and named for Wade's first wife, slept peacefully in a cradle inside, her tiny features peaceful in repose. "Papa," Daniel called, spotting Wade in the doorway. "Come see what Mama showed me." Wade joined them in the garden, scooping his son into his arms while Faith looked on with a smile that still, after all these years, made his heart race. Her honey-colored hair was pinned up, escaped tendrils framing a face that had long since healed from the bruises that had first drawn him to her, but had lost none of its power to captivate him. "What did Mama show you?" Wade asked, settling Daniel on his hip. "Seeds." The boy announced proudly, opening his small hand to reveal several dark seeds. "For next spring, Mama says they'll be flowers, but they don't look like flowers." "That's the magic of growing things," Faith explained, moving to stand beside her husband and son. "They have to change completely before they become what they're meant to be." Wade's free arm slipped around Faith's waist, pulling her closer. "Sounds familiar," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Faith leaned into him, her expression serene as she looked out over the home they had built together, the expanded cabin now boasting a proper kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a small schoolroom where Faith taught not only their children but several others from neighboring homesteads. The garden provided vegetables and herbs through summer and fall, and Wade's skill as a hunter and trapper ensured they never went hungry in winter. It wasn't always easy. The mountains were as unforgiving as ever, the winters long and harsh, the isolation sometimes challenging. But Wade and Faith faced each difficulty together, their love deepened by shared struggles and joys. As they stood in the autumn sunlight, their son chattering happily about seeds and flowers, Wade reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had spent 15 years running from pain, avoiding emotional connections, convinced that isolation was safer than vulnerability. Then Faith had appeared in that Bozeman saloon, her bruised face a testament to human cruelty, yet her eyes still holding hope and dignity. In helping her find justice and safety, Wade had found something he'd never expected to discover again. Love that made life worth living, that made taking risks worthwhile, that transformed isolation into connection and loneliness into family. The harsh cowboy who had once avoided love like death itself had learned that true strength lay not in emotional distance, but in the courage to open one's heart despite past pain. Faith's bruised face had changed everything for Wade Dawson, had brought him from darkness into light, from solitude into love, from mere existence into a life rich with meaning and purpose. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, bathing their mountain home in golden light, Wade held his family close, grateful beyond words for second chances and the healing power of love that could transform even the most wounded heart.